My name's Sam Dix. I'm a client services consultant here at Macro 4.
Good afternoon. My name's Phil Oldfield. I'm also a client services consultant at Macro 4. Just a bit of housekeeping for you before we begin the session. We are recording today, so we have muted the lines, but we do encourage questions from those attending. And if you'd like to ask a question, then please use the Q&A function, which should be somewhere down the bottom right-hand side of the screen in the WebEx controls. And we will endeavour to answer those questions for you towards the end of this presentation.
So as I said, welcome along. This is the second of 3 webinars around legacy application decommissioning, and this particular one is focusing on compliance and business risk. Well, first of all, let's start with why you need the data. It could be for compliance reasons, it could be operational, legal, or even customer service reasons that you need to service customer inquiries on historical data. But what happens if the data itself is static, or a subset of it is static itself? Why keep it in its original format and on the original system? And these 2 areas, as mentioned, we're talking about today. First of all, compliance. And there are different requirements for compliance. They could be PAYE, human resources requirements, HIPAA, the GDPR. There's a number of different compliance reasons that are out there, and we'll talk about a number of them today. But the other side of it as well is business risk. What happens if an aging and old application stops working, or if you lose the data? That itself can and will put you at business risk.
Absolutely. Now, I've got a quote for you now. It's a Gartner quote. Now, it is a couple of years old, but we still think it remains pretty relevant today. So I'm going to read the direct quote now. So Gartner say, every dollar invested in digital business innovation through to the end of 2020 will require enterprises to spend at least 3 times that to continuously monitor or modernize, rather, the legacy application portfolio. So what we're asking today, if you do have a portfolio with those legacy static applications, is this a good way to be spending your IT budget?
Yeah, and that quote, Phil, although it's 2 years old, it's still very relevant. And the pandemic and the effects of that within our businesses, accelerates that, it exacerbates it as well, the issue around, are you spending money when you shouldn't need to? So some things to consider. How are you enforcing data retention policies that have to meet statutory obligations in these older applications? Can they do that? Can you provide information lifecycle management for compliance? Think about data minimization within the GDPR. And further, if you want to talk about data governance, if you have several different applications, are you sure that your staff that are tasked within data governance are actually going to all of those applications and getting all of the data out of them? Makes life a lot more difficult for you. And then around business risk, can you fix the applications if one of them, for example, goes wrong? If you need a new browser that you're enforced by your desktop operating system, or if you need a new server operating system because they're actually getting security updates, will an old application work and support on those older systems? And it's not just about the application or the operating system. Think about the hardware as well. If you've got an older server that's sitting there, you may have a great maintenance company that's providing support for you. But should you actually be looking on eBay, for example, for old server parts? And believe me, it does happen.
Absolutely. And following on from what Sam says, so these applications, if they don't have the granular management and control, you could be putting your business at risk potentially there of falling foul of regulations that the underlying data, that static underlying data, may be subject to. So you need to ask things like, can your legacy application support subject access requests? And this is, of course, where somebody puts in a request for all the information that you store on them, and then you have to kind of collate that easily and quickly and pass that back to them. And similarly, the right to be forgotten. So that's where someone's putting a request that you delete the data that you hold against them, and then you have to go through that similar process, but this time to delete that information. Of course, regulations such as the GDPR require that these features are present in your applications, but also the processes that those applications support. Now, I've mentioned the GDPR there, and I think Sam mentioned it earlier, but there are, of course, other regulatory compliances that you may have to adhere to, and they have their own kind of peculiarities or functionality that they require. So just a few examples for you now. We've got Sarbanes-Oxley. So this is a US federal law for financial records, or the storage of financial records. You've got Basel III for banking. That's, of course, linked to the Financial Conduct Authority. Now, if you're doing work or business with companies in America, you have to be aware of things like the CCPA, and that's the California Consumer Privacy Act. But also that's more recently, I should say, been strengthened by the CPRA, which is the California Privacy Rights Act, easy for me to say.
Well remembered.
So, those just a few examples. Now, we're not experts in those regulations, and we never profess to knowing all of them, but there's just a few examples, and our solutions and technology can help you to be compliant with some of those regulations.
Yeah, absolutely, Phil. So, taking that further then, what do you need to identify within your IT landscape that could be causing you problems? Well, first of all, think about those applications that don't meet data privacy regulations. That's quite important for the GDPR. That's the top one at the moment. But also that don't meet modern security standards. We've mentioned some of that in detail in the last webinar. And those applications themselves could contain business critical data, but the application may not be fit for purpose. Originally, it may have been designed or set up for one or two departments in your organization or brands within your organization. And then you've introduced more, but then you can't add them in. The application may not be fit for purpose anymore. And what happens if the application stops working? Can you afford the business risk to support a new operating system, to support a new hardware? I mean, do you even have the staff still available? With redundancy in the staff, 2 members of staff available to support the application. If Phil's on holiday, I'm the only one supporting it. Well, that's not great. What happens if I'm the only one that knows it and then Phil's just covering? Leaves you at business risk.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to run through a use case for you now, and this is a case study customer that we've worked with in the past. So basically, this is the customer is the National Grid. And historically, they had 12 regional mainframe computers, all storing what they referred to as mine data, M-I-N-E data. And that essentially was pipe information, or they called it asset information, but basically pipe information. They needed to store this pipe information, if you like, for a couple of reasons, really. The first being, they needed the information for Ofgem, the regulator, because they needed to store information about the quality standards and the maintenance of those pipes that were built under the ground. And the second one they needed to store the data was for their customers, I suppose. So it would be this would be construction or building companies who may be looking to dig foundations or even set up a new site, and they needed to know that they weren't about to drill straight into a gas main, for example. So, very, very important information that National Grid needed to hold on to and to store in a secure kind of repository. So Macro 4 assisted National Grid by storing this extracted static data from those mainframes and the applications themselves into our Columbus technology, and Columbus being a secure, modern, future-proof repository. And that also provides fast access to that underlying data that we'd extracted and stored within our technology. They were very pleased, I'm happy to say, and they provided us with a quote that I'm going to read for you now. So this is a direct quote from the customer. And they say, "We wanted to avoid the resource and technical burdens of complex data migration. We looked at various alternatives, but the Columbus solution was the most cost-effective and gives us virtually instant on-screen access." So a real feather in our cap there. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be mainframes that you're looking to decommission, or mainframe applications, I should say. The most important point really is that is around the business and providing that regulatory access to remember that static underlying data that those applications use.
Well, how do you tackle the challenges? First of all, ensure that you know what the relevant regulatory compliance is. Things like HR, POE, HIPAA, non-financial or personal. For example, the Ofgem, the regulatory compliance that Phil mentioned there. So it could be within your industry or different areas within your organisation. There's two different things there. And from there, identify the static applications within the organisation. And these could be duplicate applications where there's multiple instances of the same application, say 2 HR applications. Why would you have that? Things like mergers and acquisitions where 2 companies have come together, you go forward with one HR application, but it's not been possible to port the data. Why keep that older application running? Get the data out of there and make it useful in a business orientated way. And mentioning that, work with the business to understand what their business requirements are. It's all very well approaching this from an IT point of view, but approach it from a business point of view. How do the business users need to be able to use the data now and in the future? There's no point putting an SQL engine on the front of a database if you're talking non-technical users are accessing it. And then think about the data itself. Can it be migrated? Can you move it from one application to a newer application? Fair enough. Or can it be deleted? If the regulatory compliance says that personal information needs to be kept for 7 years and the data itself is already 8 years old, why not just delete the data and the application itself? It will save you money and reduce your business risk. However, we find that speaking with customers and prospective customers, that the data itself will need to be archived. You need to keep it for quite a long time. Things like the mine data needs to be kept for a number of years because you're talking about assets that are retained for a long, long time. Just a point on that, backing up to tape isn't really an option. It's not compliant. You may take the application, store it down to tape with its data, and then you think, oh, we'll restore it when we need it, say for audit purposes. But when you start thinking about regulatory compliance around when the data has to be deleted or got rid of or right to be forgotten for customers, you can't do that on a tape backup. It may be a cost effective, but it's a business risk issue for you. So think about making a business case to move the data into a secure repository, that you can impose the access levels, that the business user access the data in the format that makes sense to them, really. And the data itself is stored with regulatory compliance in mind, and it can meet those requirements. And then that you're not reliant on scarce IT skills. And lastly, understand the costs around your IT landscape. You may have several VMs dotted around different servers. Each one of those VMs, however, is taking energy, and energy costs are rising at the moment. If you can reduce those, it can help your business.
Absolutely. So how can we help them? Well, Macro4's Columbus solution does help ensures compliance. It's got a number of features and bits of functionality. So, for example, it's the data that we extract and store within the repository. That's encrypted at rest. We also have things like a tamper-evident audit log. So not only are we preventing people tampering with the data in a way that they shouldn't, but also they won't be able to cover their tracks if they do, because we have the evident audit logs. And also we provide or can provide redaction of PII, so that's personally identifiable information, for those users that do not have the correct level of authority to look at that sensitive information. So Macro4's legacy application decommissioning solution is based on our Columbus technology, which we've mentioned a couple of times already for you. Now, this is a modern solution with its own ongoing development roadmap. So, that provides you with a safe choice, not only now, but also going forwards into the future. What we like to say is move your data into Columbus and you won't need to move it again. So Macro4's solution, Amongst other things, it includes processes to move data from multiple applications to this single secure repository. So it's not just a one-for-one. You might have a number of legacy applications that are causing you issues. Take the data from those and store them in a single place, single repository. This keeps the data accessible to support the business and the processes that they require. And of course, it meets these security levels that some of your older applications may not be able to do. This helps you meet those compliance requirements, and that in turn helps you to reduce the business risk that Sam mentioned as well earlier. But all in all, this is helping you to retire those problematic legacy applications.
Yeah, and that's going to help you with compliance, business risk, and cost. Yeah. So at this stage, before we wrap up, thank you for attendance so far. We will be wrapping up in a moment with a few points. But does anybody have any questions? I had a look a second ago, and there's a couple have come in, but it's not too late to ask any questions you've got. I can see somebody type in now, so thank you. The first question then is from Derek. With regards to GDPR or the GDPR, how does your solution help? Well, Phil, I think you've mentioned GDPR the most. I'm going to hand that on to you then.
Okay, I'm happy to answer this one. And thanks, Derek, for your question there. Okay, so the software that our solution uses helps support processes such as, really around data minimization and data governance. So I'm talking predominantly around things like that I mentioned earlier, but subject access requests and also the right to be forgotten.
Yep.
But the important point here is it's the processes that need to be compliant and not just the software. So what I mean by that is the software won't necessarily make you GDPR compliant, but it assists in making your processes compliant.
Yeah, good point, Phil.
I hope that answers your question. I'm just looking. There is another one here I can see has come in. This one's from Millie. Millie says, if we have multiple regulatory compliances, does your solution support more than one? Sam, you've mentioned a few of those.
Yeah, so you're going to pass the hot potato to me then.
Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Well, Millie, thank you for your question. So the repository we use can have multiple areas, both in storage, but also in terms of access levels and compliance areas itself as well, things like the information lifecycle management areas. So you could put HR in one area with its own storage set, its own set of accesses to that, and its own retention rules. And then you may have a more business-facing, customer-facing set, which has to be related to Basel III, for example, and that itself will have its own storage policies and access requirements. And again, each area within our repository can meet those. So I think that we cover it really.
I think so. Just checking for.
Yeah, I can't see any other, Phil.
No, I can't see any more coming. So I think we're going to move on at this stage. And Sam, I'll hand over to you then.
Great. So in summary, consider how the business is going to use the data now, but more importantly, into the future. Identify the applications that are putting you at risk, both operational and compliance risk. And then think about making the business case to move to a single secure data repository.
Absolutely. So now we're coming to the end of this presentation for you. So just a reminder that the next legacy application decommissioning webinar, this one, it will be on increasing business efficiency, and that includes saving time and money. So look out for that one that's coming up next month in March, and we will of course send you a registration link for that.
So let's wrap up. Thank you for attending, and it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.